At exactly 1:47 in the morning, a masked figure stepped into the infrared glow of a security camera. Every piece of evidence points to a predator who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly who he was taking. They needed to find the point of breach. They started pulling the data from the home security systems, hoping the eyes of the house had caught a glimpse of the phantom who took her. What they found on the server would introduce a deeply troubling chronological anomaly that threw the timeline into chaos. The police accessed the cloud server connected to the security cameras mounted outside the residence. They expected to find footage of a vehicle pulling up or a group of assailants rushing the front door. Instead, they found a single chilling video file time-stamped at exactly 1:47 in the morning on February 1st. The footage is dark and grainy, but the subject is unmistakable. A lone figure steps into the frame, moving with a terrifying and calculated calmness. He is dressed head to toe in black clothing, designed to absorb the light and obscure his features. His face is completely covered by a dark mask, which investigators suspect may have been purchased at a local Walmart. If you want to examine the unexplained evidence and reconstruct every single detail of this fractured timeline, hit the subscribe button. He is heavily armed, carrying a visible weapon that suggests he is fully prepared to use lethal force if confronted. Strapped tightly to his back is a very specific piece of gear, a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack. This is not the kind of bag you bring to carry a stolen television. It is a tactical choice designed for mobility and utility. The camera captures him walking deliberately toward the front entrance of the home. He does not pause to scan for alarms. According to Fox 10, the suspect was reportedly highly familiar with the specific layout of the property and the exact placement of the security devices. He reaches up toward the doorbell camera, and within a matter of seconds, he systematically disables the device. The video feed freezes and then cuts to black. That blackout at 1:47 a.m. is the most crucial piece of forensic evidence in the entire case. Here at Shadows with Liam, we do not rely on wild speculation. We let the forensic truth speak for itself. It gives the investigators a face, or at least a masked profile, of the alleged kidnapper. It confirms that the home invasion was a premeditated and heavily armed assault. But when the detectives cross-referenced that specific timestamp with the physical evidence at the crime scene, a horrifying contradiction emerged. A contradiction that completely shatters the logical sequence of events. Let us review the facts established so far. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed, securing Nancy inside. At 1:47 a.m., the armed man in the Ozark backpack walked up to the front porch and disabled the camera. At 11:56 a.m., the family found the back door standing wide open. If you look closely at that timeline, a terrifying question begins to form. The camera at the front of the house was disabled at nearly 2 in the morning. We are going to break down the exact sequence of events that transformed a quiet, but the physical breach, the actual point of entry and exit, was the back door. Did the intruder break in through the back of the house, snatch the 84-year-old woman, drag her out into the night, and then decide to casually walk around to the front porch just to turn off a camera? That makes absolutely no tactical sense. If he had already successfully completed the abduction and exited through the rear, why would he risk exposing himself to the front camera at all? Or did he approach the front porch first, disable the camera at 1:47 a.m., and then proceed to the back of the house to break in? If he disabled the camera first to clear a path, why did he leave the back door open when he left? And most disturbingly, what happened during the 4-hour gap between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m.? Was he inside the house that whole time, waiting in the dark while she slept, home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, into the center of a nationwide manhunt? Was the camera disabled before the kidnapping, or was it disabled after the nightmare was already over? This chronological fracture leaves the detectives staring at a black screen with more questions than answers. The timeline is broken, and the pieces do not fit together. Tell us your theory about this impossible sequence of events down in the comments below, because the investigators were just as baffled as you are. The suspect had vanished into the black hole he created, leaving behind a mystery that seemed to defy the laws of time and logic. But the front porch held one more secret that the camera did not capture. The disabled camera at 1:47 in the morning provided a terrifying visual of the alleged attacker, but it did not explain how the extraction actually occurred. The detectives needed physical forensic evidence to anchor their theories. They needed something tangible left behind in the dark. This is a story about an overlooked security device that completely rewrote the official narrative of a high-profile kidnapping. As the crime scene unit meticulously processed the exterior of the property, they focused their attention on the front porch right beneath the blind spot of the broken security camera. The concrete surface appeared clean at first glance, but forensic technicians know that violence always leaves a permanent trace. Using specialized lighting and chemical reagents, they painstakingly scanned the immediate area around the front entrance. What they found chillingly confirmed that the vanishing of the 84-year-old woman was not a peaceful or quiet event. Smeared against the surface of the porch was a distinct trace of human blood. It was a relatively small amount, but in the terrifying context of a missing elderly person, it was a massive and devastating discovery. The crime scene investigators carefully swabbed the biological material and rushed it to the state crime lab for expedited DNA analysis. The waiting period was absolutely agonizing for the family as they prayed for a miracle while bracing for the worst possible news. When the laboratory results finally came back on February 5th, the scientific conclusion was absolute and undeniable. It forces us to ask what happens when the very technology designed to keep us, the DNA profile extracted from the blood on the front porch, was a perfect match to Nancy Guthrie. This undeniable physical evidence completely changed the atmosphere of the entire investigation. The blood conclusively proved that a physical altercation or a severe injury had occurred on the premises. The masked man caught on the security footage had not simply coerced her out of the house. Brutal force had been applied. Pain had been inflicted on a helpless victim. The stakes were now unimaginably high. Following the definitive DNA confirmation, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nano stepped in front of the microphones to address the public and the media. He officially and unequivocally declared the case a violent kidnapping. This was no longer just a routine missing persons inquiry. It was an active and desperate hunt for a ruthless predator who had abducted a highly vulnerable citizen. The grim declaration sent immediate shockwaves through the local community and quickly caught the attention of the national press. Safe is manipulated by someone who understands its blind spots better than we do. The profile of the case exponentially exploded when Savannah Guthrie took to the national airwaves. As a prominent television news anchor and a deeply grieving daughter, she used her massive platform to broadcast a desperate appeal to the nation. She begged for any piece of information that could possibly lead to the safe return of her beloved mother. Her emotional plea flooded the 24-hour news cycle, and suddenly the face of the missing grandmother was broadcasting on millions of televisions across the entire country. The public exposure was a highly calculated risk taken by the family and the authorities. They desperately needed anonymous tips from the community to identify the masked man with the Ozark Trail hiker backpack. They needed someone somewhere to recognize his physical build or his dark clothing or his weapon. But intense media coverage is always a dangerous double-edged sword in a hostage situation. While it brings vital awareness to a stalling case, it also inevitably attracts the absolute darkest elements of society. The figure caught on that brief footage was not a random burglar looking for a quick score. The police investigation was currently stalled at the physical boundaries of the crime scene. They had a broken timeline, a single drop of blood, and an open back door. They had no license plate numbers and no clear direction of travel. The physical trail of the armed abductor had gone completely cold in the dry desert air. The dedicated detectives were meticulously combing through neighborhood security feeds and massive cell tower data dumps, hoping to catch a fleeting digital ghost. They were desperately waiting for the alleged kidnapper to make a crucial tactical mistake. They were waiting for him to reach out and demand a hefty ransom for his high-profile hostage. But when the terrible silence was finally broken, the communication did not come. Through a disposable burner phone or a handwritten note left at a physical drop site. The next agonizing phase of this nightmare suddenly materialized in the untraceable digital realm. He came prepared for a very specific task. It started quietly at first, but quickly escalated into a terrifying barrage of electronic threats. The physical investigation had hit a solid brick wall, but a new and chaotic front was about to open up online. The kidnapper, or perhaps someone merely claiming to be him, had finally decided to step out of the shadows and make his demands known to the world. The investigation into the missing matriarch suddenly shifted from physical canvassing to tracking an avalanche of digital noise. Law enforcement agencies were desperately trying to trace the origin of a series of highly sophisticated extortion messages. Multiple threatening emails began flooding the inboxes of prominent journalists. The local news station, KOLD-TV, was among the first to receive these terrifying digital ultimatums, followed rapidly by several national media conglomerates. The demands were explicitly clear and incredibly urgent. The sender wanted a massive payout delivered exclusively through untraceable cryptocurrency. This decentralized financial demand added a brutal layer of complexity to the already chaotic manhunt. The intruder was heavily armed and moved with terrifying precision. The 25-liter capacity of that backpack was not meant for stolen electronics or jewelry. Detectives specialized in cybercrimes were brought in to trace the encrypted network packets bouncing across international servers. But this surge of communication introduced a terrifying complication for the hostage negotiators. Were these crypto demands actually originating from the heavily armed individual who orchestrated the abduction, or were they the work of opportunistic digital scavengers? Whenever a high-profile incident hits the national broadcast networks, a swarm of internet predators inevitably descends to exploit the tragedy. They scrape public information from press briefings and weave it into plausible threats to extort grieving relatives. The authorities had to verify if the sender possessed non-public knowledge about the crime scene. Did the person writing these emails know about the specific items left behind in the master bedroom? Did they know the exact layout of the rear patio? The cyber division worked frantically around the clock to authenticate the demands, while the physical search grid expanded deeper into the unforgiving desert landscape. The presence of these emails essentially hijacked the narrative and forced the tactical teams to split their highly limited resources. It was brought into that house for a much more sinister purpose. Every hour spent verifying a digital wallet address was an hour lost in the physical pursuit of a vulnerable captive. The emotional toll on the relatives was absolute agony as they were forced to wait while analysts debated the credibility of unseen hackers. The situation grew infinitely more volatile as the ransom deadlines approached without a solid proof of life. The perpetrators were operating with a level of digital hygiene that suggested extensive premeditation. This was not a spontaneous crime of opportunity. The operation was designed to maximize psychological pressure by leveraging the public prominence of the family. The media frenzy acted as an amplifier for the terror. Helicopters circled the neighborhood and satellite trucks blocked the residential streets while the actual captor remained completely invisible. The contrast between the overwhelming law enforcement presence and the absolute lack of tangible progress created a suffocating atmosphere of dread. The community began to realize that their expensive security gates and private patrols were entirely to understand the sheer gravity of that 1:47 a.m. blackout. We have to rewind the clock, useless, against an adversary who understood how to manipulate both the physical and digital realms. The investigation was drowning in a sea of unverified leads and contradictory intelligence. The core anomaly of the physical breach still remained unsolved. How did an intruder maintain such absolute control over an occupied residence without triggering a single perimeter alarm until the very end of his operation? The answer to that terrifying question was hidden in the behavioral pattern of the suspect. We are about to decode the psychological profile of this predator and explain the exact sequence of his movements. If you want to follow the forensic breakdown of this impossible breach, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. We track the evidence where it leads, no matter how disturbing the conclusion might be. The detectives realized they had been looking at the chronological sequence completely backward. They had to stop reacting to the chaotic flood of encrypted emails and return to the foundational logic of the primary crime scene. We have to look at the victim not as a headline, but as a person who was supposed to be completely safe behind locked doors. The digital extortion attempts were designed to create panic and misdirection. The investigators needed to block out the overwhelming noise of the national media broadcasts and focus entirely on the silent psychology of the physical infiltration the crypto demands, whether authentic or fraudulent, successfully stalled the momentum of the search teams during the most critical window of survivability. The perpetrators understood that an overload of conflicting information is the most effective way to paralyze a coordinated police response. By dumping these sophisticated threats into the public domain, they forced the authorities to divert their best analytical minds away from the residential footprints and toward untraceable server farms in foreign jurisdictions. This deliberate saturation of the investigative channels is a hallmark of highly organized criminal syndicates. It isolates the relatives and surrounds them with an impenetrable wall of digital static. As the sun set on another agonizing day of fruitless searching, the urgency morphed into a quiet and crushing despair. The encrypted messages continued to arrive, taunting the cyber units with complex routing protocols and anonymous virtual private networks. The Catalina Foothills community in Tucson is exactly the kind of place where people pay a premium for peace of mind. But beneath this elaborate smokescreen, the physical truth of the intrusion was waiting to be understood. The authorities had to strip away the cyber warfare and look at the raw mechanics of the abduction. The entire forensic puzzle finally snaps into place when we stop looking at the disabled surveillance lens as the beginning of the attack. It was never the point of entry. It was the final calculated act of a completely successful extraction. Let us reconstruct the true flow of that horrific night based on the physical evidence left in the dust. The tactical gear carried by the assailant was not designed to haul away stolen property. The spacious interior of that specific hiking pack was purposefully utilized to transport the physical tools necessary to quickly subdue a human being. We are talking about restraints and sedatives and anything required to force compliance without generating noise. The intruder did not walk up to the main entrance and announce his presence by destroying the recording device. That would have alerted the resident and triggered internal alarms. It is quiet and exclusive and bathed in the false security of gated driveways and neighborhood watches. Instead, he bypassed the visible security perimeter entirely. He exploited the natural blind spots of the property and accessed the structure through the rear access point. This completely explains why the rear portal was discovered standing ajar the following morning. He breached the interior while the neighborhood was engulfed in darkness and silence. This invisible infiltration answers the most agonizing question of the entire case. The massive void in the timeline was not a period of waiting. It was the window of execution. Once inside the environment, he had absolute and terrifying control over the situation. He neutralized the target in her own domain, securing her before she could ever reach for a telephone or trigger a panic button. He executed the extraction through the very same unguarded path he used to enter. He hauled his captive out into the night, utilizing a vehicle parked securely out of range of any neighborhood sensors. It is the last place you would expect a violent home invasion and an 84-year-old woman with only after the victim was completely secured and the immediate area was physically compromised did he return to the structure. Why would a successful kidnapper walk back to the property? He returned specifically to permanently blind the surveillance network. By terminating the video feed long after the actual breach occurred, he manipulated the digital footprint of the crime. He intentionally created a false starting point for the detectives to chase. He knew the authorities would fixate on the exact moment the feed went dark, assuming it was the onset of the home invasion. This brilliant piece of forensic misdirection bought him hours of uncontested head start. He controlled the environment so thoroughly that he dictated exactly what the police would see and when they would see it. This was not a smash and grab operation gone terribly wrong. It was a masterclass in psychological and physical domination. Limited mobility is the absolute last person you would expect to be the target of a heavily armed predator. The perpetrator weaponized the predictable assumptions of modern law enforcement against them. He understood that modern detectives rely heavily on digital timestamps to build their initial theories. By corrupting that primary data source, he effectively shattered their compass. The chilling reality is that the heavily armed ghost captured on that brief infrared snippet was not sneaking into the house. He was walking away from a completed mission. If this forensic reconstruction changes your entire perspective on how home invasions can be manipulated, please hit the like button and share this analysis. It is crucial to understand how predators exploit our reliance on automated safety systems. The sheer audacity required to execute the kidnapping and then casually return to sabotage the electronics demonstrates a terrifying level of criminal confidence. He felt completely untouchable. He knew the response protocols, and he knew the typical reaction times of private security patrols. He danced around the technological safeguards with the precision of a military operative. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. She is a grandmother who lives a quiet and private life. The delayed sabotage of the equipment also explains the distinct lack of collateral damage inside the residence. There was no desperate ransacking or chaotic destruction of property. Every single movement within those walls was deliberate and highly focused. He entered with a singular, terrifying objective, and he accomplished it flawlessly. The sophisticated nature of this timeline manipulation suggests that the perpetrators had rehearsed the scenario multiple times. They likely conducted extensive surveillance on the property, mapping out the blind spots and calculating the exact field of view of every lens. They knew exactly where the boundaries of the digital safety net ended and the shadows began. This level of meticulous preparation elevates the threat level from a local hazard to a highly organized professional threat. The shattered timeline is no longer a confusing anomaly. It is the clearest indicator of the extreme danger posed by this unidentified suspect. She is also the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the well-known co-host of the Today Show on NBC News. The realization that the victim was likely already miles away before the first alarm ever registered is a devastating blow to the investigative teams. They were hunting a phantom who had successfully rewritten the rules of the engagement. The technological safeguards that were purchased to provide peace of mind had been seamlessly transformed into instruments of deception. The devastating clarity of the reconstructed timeline leaves the community grappling with a profound sense of vulnerability. The active perimeter has long since been dismantled, and the tactical units have retreated from the immediate neighborhood. The desert landscape has swallowed the physical trail, leaving behind an agonizing vacuum of information. The official investigation remains an open and highly active priority, but the initial momentum has inevitably slowed. Law enforcement agencies continue to sift through the massive volume of digital tips and unverified sightings. But the agonizing reality is that the primary suspect has vanished completely. The physical evidence collected from the concrete surface is securely locked in an evidence vault, serving as a grim anchor to the brutal reality of that night. He wore entirely black clothing and carried a specific 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack. But on the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy was simply a mother enjoying a routine family dinner. The sophisticated extortion attempts have faded into the murky depths of the dark web, leaving behind zero actionable intelligence. The family continues to endure a waking nightmare trapped in a state of suspended grief. They are unable to find closure and unable to move forward. The empty house stands as a silent monument to the terrifying capabilities of a determined predator. But beyond the forensic analysis and the digital forensics, there is one deeply haunting question that refuses to be ignored. It is a question that strips away all the technical jargon and strikes at the absolute core of human empathy. How did a frail and medically dependent senior citizen endure the brutal conditions of her captivity during those critical first few hours? The physical shock of being forcibly removed from a warm bed and dragged into the freezing night air would be overwhelming for anyone, but for a person who relies on strict daily regimens of prescription medication, the biological clock is a far more ruthless enemy than any armed captor. Her fragile system was suddenly violently deprived of the very chemical support it needed to function. At 5:32 that evening, she took an Uber to the house of her daughter. Did her captors understand the extreme medical fragility of their hostage? Did they have a contingency plan to keep her alive long enough to secure their financial demands? Or did they view her strictly as a disposable asset? The horrific probability is that the severe physical trauma, combined with the immediate lack of vital pharmaceuticals, created a medical emergency within the first 24 hours. The sheer terror of the abduction, coupled with the sudden physiological withdrawal, is a dark and terrifying reality to contemplate. The silence from the kidnappers after the initial flurry of encrypted demands suggests a deeply troubling shift in the dynamic. Did the operation collapse because the captive could not survive the initial shock of the extraction? This unbearable uncertainty is the most vicious weapon wielded by the perpetrators. It denies the loved ones the basic human right to understand the final moments of their matriarch. The authorities are left chasing digital shadows while the community struggles to rebuild their shattered illusion of safety. The case files remain open and the detectives remain dedicated to the pursuit of justice. It was a completely normal winter evening. There was no indication that she was being watched or followed by anyone. Every piece of encrypted data and every grainy image is subjected to relentless analysis. But as the days turn into weeks, the cold reality of the desert begins to set in. A human being was effectively erased from a highly secure environment without triggering a single immediate alarm. The neighborhood continues to function with its private patrols and its high walls, but the residents now look at those defenses with a deep and unsettling suspicion. They understand that those barriers are nothing more than an optical illusion. The true horror of this unresolved mystery is the lingering knowledge that the predator is still out there. He possesses the skills to bypass sophisticated perimeters and the psychological cruelty to execute a flawless abduction. He remains a faceless threat moving freely through the world while his victims are forever trapped in a cycle of endless questioning and agonizing doubt. The story remains unfinished. The final chapter has yet to be written. The answers remain hidden in the dark, and the chilling silence of the sweeping desert offers absolutely no comfort to those left waiting. She spent several hours surrounded by family, eating and talking and feeling entirely secure. The profound trauma inflicted on this family serves as a permanent scar on the entire community. This chilling investigation fundamentally dismantles our modern reliance on automated domestic security. What this case teaches us about residential protection is that external surveillance technology is virtually useless if the physical perimeter is compromised first. Cameras are passive observers. They do not stop physical breaches. The perpetrator demonstrated that by targeting the vulnerable rear access points and neutralizing the environment from the inside out, a criminal can easily render front-facing deterrence entirely obsolete. Relying solely on a digital doorbell to secure a property is a dangerous modern fallacy. True security requires layered physical friction and internal motion detection that cannot be bypassed by simply avoiding the front porch. Furthermore, what this case teaches us about the collateral damage of public prominence is deeply disturbing. Fame creates a massive expanding blast radius that frequently endangers the most vulnerable individuals connected to the public figure. At 9:50 that night, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her back to her home in the foothills. High-profile personalities are heavily guarded, but their extended relatives often live completely unprotected in the open. Predators understand this dynamic perfectly. They do not attack the fortified target. They identify the weakest link in the familial chain and strike where the defenses are non-existent. By targeting an elderly relative, an extortionist can apply catastrophic emotional and psychological pressure on the primary figure without ever crossing their dedicated security details. This forces us to reevaluate the concept of safety in the digital age. When public exposure increases, the protective umbrella must deliberately extend to cover every single accessible connection. The exposure of one individual inevitably compromises the anonymity of their entire circle. This tragedy is a clinical demonstration of how fame can be weaponized against the innocent. It serves as a stark warning for anyone navigating the treacherous intersection of extreme public visibility and private domestic life. Security must be proactive rather than reactive. Darkness will always attempt to slip through the smallest unrecognized cracks in our protective systems. Security footage from that exact time shows his vehicle pulling away as the heavy garage door slowly descends. The terrifying reality we have uncovered today proves that a deliberately blinded lens can successfully conceal a catastrophic home invasion. The mastermind behind this ongoing nightmare utilized our inherent trust in automated safety to completely rewrite the physical timeline and execute a flawless disappearance. He weaponized the silence of the desert to mask his escape and left an entire nation paralyzed by unanswerable questions. But what happens when the exact opposite scenario unfolds? In our next investigation on Shadows with Liam, we are going to examine a profoundly disturbing case where a violent crime was completely captured on video. The digital evidence is absolutely pristine and the identity of the assailant is seemingly undeniable. Yet despite having high-definition footage of the entire horrific event, the authorities remain completely powerless to secure a conviction. How does a killer walk free when the entire world watched him pull the trigger? Make sure to turn on your notification bell right now so you do not miss that incredible breakdown. Until then, stay vigilant and remember that the shadows are never truly empty. That sliding wall of metal is designed to seal the home off from the outside world. It is supposed to lock the danger out. Residents in this affluent neighborhood trust their alarms and their cameras to provide an impenetrable protective shield. Nancy relied heavily on that shield. Her family trusted it too. He did not hesitate or look around. He walked directly toward the lens, and within seconds, the feed went completely dead. But as that door hit the concrete floor, it sealed Nancy inside an empty house. She was an 84-year-old woman who struggled to move around on her own. She was wearing her comfortable sleepwear and preparing for bed. The neighborhood outside grew dark and silent. The desert air settled in, and everything appeared perfectly still. Yet somewhere in that enveloping darkness, an unidentified intruder was waiting patiently. He had to be watching from the shadows. He had to know that the son-in-law had left the premises and that the elderly woman was now completely alone inside the residence. The stark contrast between the warmth of her family dinner just hours before and the cold isolation of her empty house is absolutely chilling. She locked her doors and settled in for the night, believing the world outside was safe. She had absolutely no reason to suspect that a man dressed entirely in black was already finalizing his plan to breach her quiet sanctuary. That sudden, terrifying blackout is the exact moment an entire family shattered, but it is not the true beginning of this nightmare. She had no idea about the 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack or the weapons or the mask he wore. She simply went to sleep. The garage door was closed tight. The front door was locked. The security cameras were actively scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. On paper, she was as safe as a person could possibly be in their own home. But physical barriers mean absolutely nothing to a dedicated predator who has carefully studied his prey. As the clock ticked silently past midnight, the illusion of safety began to rapidly unravel. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful or comforting. It was tense and expectant. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that always comes right before a devastating storm. Nancy was alone and physically vulnerable and completely unaware that her sanctuary was about to be violently violated. The garage door had locked the world out, but it had also locked her in with whatever was about to happen next. The real horror lies in the 4 silent hours leading up to that exact moment. Morning broke over the Catalina foothills on February 1st, 2026. The sun rose over the quiet streets and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The neighbors woke up and went about their Sunday routines, unaware of the horrifying events that had unfolded in the dark. Inside the home of Nancy, there was only a deeply unsettling stillness. She was a woman of habit and regularly attended an online church service every Sunday morning. But when the service began, her family noticed she was not logged in. By 11:56 in the morning, the unease had turned into active panic. Her family members rushed over to the house to check on her. What they found shattered their reality and escalated the situation to a critical emergency. The house was dead silent. At 12:03 in the afternoon, the family made a frantic call to 911 to report her missing. A massive void in the timeline that turns a seemingly simple crime into a chilling forensic puzzle. Law enforcement officers arrived at the scene and began to clear the residence. They moved cautiously through the rooms, looking for any sign of a struggle or any clue as to where the 84-year-old woman might have gone. The layout of the house was pristine in some areas, but horrifyingly wrong in others. The most alarming discovery was located at the rear of the property. The back door was standing wide open, letting the cold air blow into the empty house. It was a gaping wound in the security of the home, but the details left inside the house are what make this case so deeply disturbing. This was not a botched burglary where a thief panicked after finding someone home. We know this with certainty because of what the intruder chose to leave behind. We are looking at a targeted operation against an incredibly vulnerable target. A typical home invader is looking for quick cash and easily pawned electronics. They want to get in and get out fast. But sitting untouched inside the living area were the purse of Nancy and her smartphone and her Apple Watch. These are all high-value items that a standard burglar would have swept into a bag without a second thought. Even more terrifying was the discovery of her vital daily medication. The pill bottles were left sitting exactly where they belonged. A woman who struggles with mobility and relies on life-saving medicine did not simply walk out the back door in her sleepwear. Someone took her. Someone bypassed the valuable electronics and chose to carry away an 84-year-old woman who had no shoes on her feet. Why would an armed intruder ignore high-end technology and cash only to undertake the risky task of abducting an elderly woman? Moving a person against their will requires immense physical effort and carries a massive risk of getting caught. A woman who could barely move on her own snatched into the cold desert night while her neighborhood slept peacefully around her. It makes no logistical sense for a criminal. This detail completely alters the trajectory of the investigation. It eliminates the theory of a crime of opportunity. The person who left that back door wide open did not come for the Apple Watch. They came for Nancy. The open door stood as a silent testament to a targeted, organized extraction. The family stood in the house staring at the medication she desperately needed to survive. The reality of the situation was crushing. She was out there somewhere without her pills and without her phone. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed decreased the odds of bringing her home safely. The police secured the perimeter and began treating the house as a major crime scene. They needed to figure out how a masked man managed to infiltrate a secure home and vanish with a human being without alerting a single neighbor.